Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I welcome you and want to just remind you that this session is one of the first in a series that the CRC is presenting on key topics around the Murray-Darling Basin's Basin Plan Review discussion paper. And then today's particular panel session is on maximising economic outcomes under an increasingly variable climate in the Murray-Darling Basin, a very broad topic. And I'm delighted to have you with us today. So I want to begin by acknowledging country. We in the CRC acknowledge and pay our deep respects to the traditional owners of the many nations in the Murray-Darling Basin and acknowledge their deep cultural, social and spiritual, environmental and economic connection to the lands and waters on which we live. I'm joining you from Kaurna country, which has more recently been called Adelaide, and I pay my respects to the elders and the elders of all basin nations, past, present and emerging. So just to introduce you very, very quickly to the CRC, for those of you who may not be too familiar, I imagine quite a few of you are familiar with the CRC, but just in case you're not, we are a industry and research collaboration which has been established to tackle significant complex water-related challenges in the Murray-Darling Basin. We are funded for 10 years. We're about 3.5 years into our 10-year funding cycle and have a number of projects well underway, which is really exciting. Our vision is for Australia's irrigation regions to be the most productive, resilient and sustainable in the world. And our purpose is to work together to grow value from water in a changing world. We are made up of many, many different organisations as partners, both across the research sector, end user organisations of our research, and then commercialisation partners. There are around 85 organisations spanning all those sectors, 7 or so universities, and then a large number across different sectors. And in front of you there, you'll see all the logos from all the organisations. You may even see your own logo in there, depending on if you're on the call or not. A little bit of housekeeping. Now, we want to make sure that this panel session is as useful to you all as possible. So please do provide or put in questions in the Q&A function as they come to mind. No question's a bad question. This session will be the best it can be if there is a lot of good questions from the audience. So I really encourage you to put questions in the Q&A, and then in the second half of the panel session today, we'll do our best to address those questions across the panel. And if by chance there are a lot of questions and we don't get through them all, we'll also go through those later, provide our answers and provide that on the website of the CRC for you to refer to at a future point. Now, we are recording today's session. The recording will be made available through the One Basin Review CRC Review Hub on our website very soon. And so for those of you that want to, you can watch it again, or if you have to leave early, you can catch up with the rest. Or if you're not able to join today, you can watch it at some point in the future. So what are we talking about today? Well, I guess ultimately it's obviously the Basin Plan Review discussion paper and how economics and economic analysis can both inform the Basin Plan Review and actions from government as a consequence of that. So you may hopefully be aware that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority released its discussion paper in early February. I encourage you, if you're not aware, to Google it and have a look at the document. It's a considerable piece of work, and it really does talk about a lot of the issues facing the basin in relation to environmental outcomes and sustainable diversion limits in particular, but other aspects as well. But is the economy, and does that feature so much in this discussion paper? Well, probably not so much. There are mention of some of the analyses done under the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's Outlook work, and I think also the SRA, but not a lot of mention elsewhere. Although, having said that, where the word economy does feature, it is in relation to the broad suite of outcomes and values associated with water management in the basin, whether they be also social, environmental, and cultural and spiritual. So there is clear recognition that economics is part of the system, but not a strong reference so much in the discussion paper. We all know that water, the environment, and the economy, and people and culture are inseparable. There really is no economy and society without a healthy environment, whether that's freshwater ecosystems, biodiversity and terrestrial landscapes, or agricultural systems as well. The MDB is an integrated system, and we cannot forget that. And so, as we will hear today, the economic costs, benefits, and trade-offs are central to water management and policy outcomes. Next one, thank you. So, what we will cover, and these are some pretty broad topics, so we're unlikely to go into a lot of depth in any of these, but what we will cover are a number of aspects around the economic impacts of drought and ecosystem decline in both natural freshwater and agricultural systems. We'll touch on how to ensure equity and fairness in economic outcomes across regions, communities, etc., from implementing water reform in times of uncertainty and rapid change. That's clearly a big issue at the moment. Climate change is one thing, but there's a lot of rapid change. Fuel prices is the most prominent one at the moment. That is causing a lot of uncertainty within the basin. We'll also touch on the role of government and communities in supporting economic transition and building resilience in a future that with potentially less water, particularly in the southern basin. And that's going to provide pose a lot of economic and social and environmental challenges for everyone in the basin. And then we'll probably touch on also the basin plan in incentivising public and private investment in good environmental stewardship and sustainable land and water management. So I'd now like to introduce the panelists. We have Julie Bates, who is the Chief Executive of Regional Development Australia, Murray-Lands and Riverland region, and she has over 20 years of regional experience supporting business growth, collaboration and sustainable development to build resilient local communities. We also have Councillor Julia Spicer, who has a Order of Australia Medal, quite a fantastic achievement there. And Julia is on the Gundawindi Regional Council. She's co-founder of the Connection Table, which is a rural, regional and remote leadership network. She's also Deputy Chair of the Australia Economic Accelerator Board, an entrepreneur and an advocate for regional businesses, communities, and resides in Gundawindi in the Northern Basin. We also have on the panel Professor Mark Morrison, who's Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Business, Justice and Behavioural Sciences at Charles Sturt University. And his work spans a number of areas, including non-market valuation, Indigenous and regional entrepreneurship, climate change communications, as well as delivering many consultancies for government and industry over the years. Mark also leads one of the new projects in the One Basin CRC, which is called Future Basin Economies, Innovative Approaches to Design and Deliver Economic Investments Wanted by Basin Communities. And then fourth on the panel is Dr. Jeremy Cheeseman, who is a natural capital and environmental economist with over 30 years of experience across economics, policy, and governance. And Jeremy is a PhD qualified executive and board member with strong government, non-government organisation and private sector networks. And he's recently done a lot of work with the MDB on the socio-economic conditions assessment that supported the Sustainable Rivers Audit and the Basin Plan Outlook. And has also done a lot of work with Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, Commonwealth level and at state, again, working on social economic issues in the Murray-Darling Basin. And then you have me as the chair, and I'm Professor Neville Crossman, who also has a program lead and government engagement role at the One Basin CRC, and I'm a professorial research fellow in economics at Flinders Uni. So that's enough of the introductions. What I will do now is invite each of our speakers or each of our panel members in turn to give a 2 to 3 minute opening statement. And I'll start with Jeremy, who's going to share his thoughts on what's really the single biggest economic risk the Basin Plan must address.
Thanks, Nev. Hi, everybody. Hope you're all well, and thanks for joining us for this chat today. We're starting off with a pretty small question. What's the biggest single economic risk that the basin plan must address? And it's pretty it's a bit of a task to respond to that in 3 minutes. But I think from our perspective, the basin plan, 2012 basin plan under the 2007 Water Act, it's really designed to optimise environmental, social, and economic outcomes through sustainable limits on water use. And probably everybody on the call knows that. But it's fundamentally a water planning instrument. It's not an economic risk management tool per se. And even going through this basin plan review, I don't think that those objectives and the basin plan being fundamentally a water planning tool is going to shift, given that those objectives to optimise environmental, social, and economic outcomes actually sit in the Act, and the plan instrument is really around how we implement that. But having said that, I think potentially the biggest economic risk now that we should be thinking about is how we correctly or best manage future adjustment under uncertainty, including climate uncertainty, but all sorts of other uncertainties that we know are going to play out over the next 50 years, but we don't exactly know how they're going to play out. So the risk here is that we mismanage adjustment, and there's an economic consequence of that. And, we can do that, I think, in a lot of ways. And anybody who runs a business or a business out in the regions would know what these things look like. It could involve locking in high regret investments too early before we know what the future looks like. It could involve governments not being clear and coordinating economic responses or economic development plans across different levels of government. Or it can even be government changing its mind about policy and the direction for regional communities or things that happen. Those sorts of uncertainties undermine business confidence, investment confidence, and economic growth. So I think for me, the key risk is, and the key risk and what we can de-risk is recognizing that there are multiple future uncertainties. There are lots of drivers beyond water that we need to be thinking about. And the basin plan is just one economic risk and economic opportunity that we need to be thinking about. I think the other thing, just under the current plan and the potential future plan, is it's not going to directly seek to manage economic risk through the instrument. Really, what the basin plan does is it creates and shapes risks through balancing objectives across the economy, the environment, and communities. But what really manages risk is how governments act and respond to these objects. And so, it's probably really important to say here that the responsibility for implementation of economic outcomes really sits with basin governments collectively. It doesn't sit with the MDBA. And, that for me is, a tension and a gap that we need to keep our eyes on. So, in closing, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that governments can help mitigate big economic risks, first by coordinated action, secondly by being clear on what that collective action looks like for the benefit of communities and regions, and really importantly, seeing and responding to those economic risks in the context that the basin plan is one thing, and that we should be thinking about responses across a whole range of different drivers that will change communities over time. So essentially, don't treat the basin plan and the economic risks that it poses in isolation from everything else, because frankly, that's not the way the world works. And that's not, we know, the history of how the basin has evolved over time. Thanks, Nev.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. That's an excellent point about risk and uncertainty and effectively flexibility from above. So now taking a slightly different perspective, which is I'm going to invite Julia Spicer from Gundawindi to share her views on what does successful economic development look like in practice for a basin community.
Thanks, Nev, and it's great to come after some of the comments that Jeremy just made for us all on the call. As Neville said, I'm on Big and Bull country here in Gundawindi, and we have obviously had a period of time looking at what can be done to be able to manage for and innovate around water use efficiency and adjustments to water allocation, particularly for our irrigated communities along the border. And I guess anything that I talk to is really around how we make sure that we're maintaining the viability and the vibrancy of our regional communities. And I'll particularly talk to Gundawindi in the Northern Basin, but I am pretty sure that some of the comments I make today are just as relevant from the north to the south when it comes to our communities across the Murray-Darling Basin, and particularly the local councils across the footprint of where the plan is happening. And so when we look at what does successful economic development look like for the majority of us, but particularly in my community, we are an agriculturally based community. We have dry land and irrigation, we have a range of different crops, we have livestock, but at the end of the day, any of the economic development and any of the economic diversification is really only across agriculture. We will not have a tourism industry that's booming and all of a sudden taking over the income that we gather as a region from agriculture. And I think that's a really important thing. We can talk about economic diversity and we can talk about making sure we've got really strong, viable businesses. But the reality for a lot of us is that foundational industry is always going to be agriculture. And therefore, it's around looking at, well, where are the tweaks and the opportunities we have to be able to create secondary and tertiary services and opportunities off that base industry. And always through the lens of agriculture. So for me, it is really important that when we're having these conversations about the review for the basin plan, to Jeremy's point, is we are not looking at this just through water as an isolation. Our producers, our irrigators, our communities, this is but one of the challenges that we are trying to manage and ensure that our businesses can remain viable. Nev mentioned fuel. In terms of that cost to business at the moment. We're a cross-border community, so we're dealing with multiple pieces of legislation. We can certainly talk more about the global markets and what's happening in that space, and therefore what this piece of national sovereignty is. But I really think I'm keen to have the conversation in the next hour around the history has always been, what are the tipping points for environment? Equally, for me, we're at a tipping point now around populations and holding populations in our regions. And for that, we need to be able to be really clear that our communities and our local councils can remain viable and are not vulnerable to any changes and any more adjustments that might come through future reviews. People will have heard of the comment around, death by 1,000 cuts. I think we're at 999. So we've got to be really careful about what comes next and what that means for those of us in leadership positions at a local level, because we are the most visible level of government and the least funded. And I might talk more about that, Nev, as we get into some of the other questions.
Great, that's excellent. Thanks, Julie. Yes, I'll be looking forward to your perspectives a bit later on local government. Now I'd like to hand the microphone virtually over to Julie, who's based in the Riverland. And I'm wondering, Julie, having just also heard what Julia has said, this isn't getting confusing, is it, Julia? Whether, as agriculture being a dominant industry in her part of the world, as it is in your part of the world, in the Riverland, but going through perhaps some very different experiences than in the north, particularly the grape or the wine grape industry at the moment. So I wonder, Julie, are there basin communities, I've kind of led the witness here already a bit, that are facing some really significant adjustment challenges? And how do those communities really identify and then capture economic opportunities to get them out of a difficult time?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And certainly some of what Julia was saying certainly resonates with the Riverland as well. From our perspective as a Riverland in particular, although I do represent sort of basically all of the South Australia's Murray River, the Riverland, the adjustment piece isn't really about, theoretical, it's lived, it's daily, it's reality for much of our region. and like Julia said, the Riverland, it's deeply connected and dependent on irrigated agriculture. The whole identity of the region is really tied strongly to that irrigated production piece. For those to give some context of the Riverland, key industries would be grapes, almonds, citrus, stone fruit, dates, olives, and there's certainly plenty of other crops as well, but they would probably be the real key ones. And the Riverland is actually a really significant contributor to South Australia's export economy. So those ripples are felt. So when we talk about water, it's not just about it being an import. It's really foundational to the viability of the Riverland. And so I think also those challenges, the Riverland really at the moment, it's at the forefront. And you touched on it just then around grapes in particular, and that's where we've seen some really significant impacts in our region, which have been devastating, to be quite frank. And it's a major disruption on top of many other challenges. Obviously drought in our region has been really significant as well, and as we've touched on already, fuels obviously certainly coming in as a major issue. We've already had major supply issues across our region. So what we see, it's not just about farm, the changes though. We see the ripple right through our entire region. So it's about all the other local supporting businesses, employment. It's about community well-being and confidence in the region as well. So that financial stress that may be felt at in the farm space also has those impacts right across our community. And in mental health for us in the Riverland has been really significant on the back of much of the issues in the grape industry and oversupply. Certainly, there's a lot of work happening, and there is a strong focus on that transition and diversification. So many growers are really active in that space, whether that be value adding their food that they grow. So that manufacturing piece for us, agri-tourism is a significant opportunity in that diversification. It's not instead of, but it's a help in the diversification piece. Much of the Riverland, to give context to those not in South Australia and familiar, Adelaide to parts of the Riverland, you're talking about 2 hours, maybe 3-hour drive to the more far reaches from Adelaide. So it's not day trip, but it's certainly got quite a large tourism industry, and that is a growing industry. And there's also a lot of diversification into the more water-wise crops. So a lot of work happening in agave, dates, and quite a large emerging industry around hemp as well. So that's just a few of the things that are happening in that diversification piece. So I would say, although certainly many challenges, it's not. For the most part, the community is not passive though. So they are trying to work really hard to adapt and innovate and look for those new opportunities. But the size and the scale of what the region's facing, it can't just sit with individuals and businesses. So that's where that government support really does come in, and that partnership piece. And certainly that's critical, and we're already seeing that where there has been some funding put in for some coordination and some help. It's really helped coordinate some of those opportunities in what can be very overwhelming for an individual business or individuals. So it's about that enabling piece. So that's where I certainly feel that there's a real role for government, for programs, for that policy setting. But I premise that with the need for that real genuine listening and aligning, and that investment to be on the ground and very place-based, and one size does not fit all in that. So two very similar businesses can be on very different paths, and I think we need to be responsive to that, and any programs and support mechanisms need to be responsive. And again, going back to what Julia said, often, local government is a really critical player in that, because they have those relationships and that trust in community, alongside, certainly in the South Australian model, RDAs are not-for-profits, are not government in South Australia. So we play a really significant support role as well. So I think I'd end with, we're facing real challenges, but we can also see as a region that there is significant opportunity, but that needs to be unlocked.
Great, thanks, Julie. That's really interesting, and really good that you started to talk about the role of government, which provides an excellent segue to our fourth panelist, Professor Mark Morrison, who I'm going to ask to respond to the question of, is government doing enough to maximise those economic opportunities? Is it doing the right things, in particular to make sure we're getting, fair and equitable outcomes?
Thanks, Nev. Is it doing enough? I'd say no, although some might contest that, but I'd say no. Is it doing the right things? I don't think so either. Some things are probably right, but I don't think overall it is. I think it's important to understand that a lot of the regional areas within the Murray-Darling Basin, they are sparse rural ecosystems. And in such rural economies, the thinking of the Austrian economists are particularly useful. That's sort of a post-war kind of reconstruction type of economics. And in that way of thinking, you need to build the economy that you want and that will thrive despite the challenges faced. You can't just leave the market to do it. It's not neoclassical world. So you've got to understand what is best practice in that case. So what is it? Well, the first thing you got to do is you got to get the scale right. You got to work at the functional economic zone level. You don't want it to be too big or too small, for example, at a local government level only. You got to get the scale right. You need kind of mama bear. You also need to use the best practice tools. From my perspective, that's smart specialisation and entrepreneurial ecosystem approaches. So smart specialisation is about identifying competitive or potentially competitive industries and working with other stakeholders across government, industry, and others, such as educational institutions and other local stakeholders, to deal with the constraints and exploit opportunities. You also need to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem. In rural areas, there's often a lack of entrepreneurs to take advantage of opportunities. So you need to support the flow of new entrepreneurs and support existing businesses and help them to innovate. You want more productive businesses that can sell outside the regional area, nationally, internationally, that bring more dollars in, circulate in the town. And you need a leadership committee that uses an evidence-based approach to look for bottlenecks, where the elements of the ecosystem are weak, and then set priorities and teams to deal with that. That's best practice. So is that being followed? Well, I actually don't think the blueprint is well enough understood across government, including their role within that journey. I don't think there's enough work that goes on identifying and dealing with the right bottlenecks and the right enablers. And the funding mechanisms don't necessarily facilitate this. I agree with Jeremy. I think there's a lack of coordinated action across and within levels of government. For example, regional development and health. Well, how could they be the same? Well, one of the precursors of good health is actually having a job. It's one of the determinants of health. So actually, regional development is very related to public health, particularly if there is unemployment in some of these rural areas or underemployment. Another example would be with sustainable communities funding. In New South Wales particular, perhaps less so the other states, almost every rural local government is having a major financial crisis, really. And they're really struggling. And that's partly been because of cost shifting from state to local. It's also been because of the rising cost of insurance and power and other bits and pieces, and pegged rates. So most of them don't have budget apart from things like roads and other key infrastructure. So if they've got to do co-funding through sustainable communities, that's the only thing they have money for. But that might not be what's needed for actually helping the ecosystem and the rural economy. It might be other aspects besides those things, but they can't find the co-funding. So to me, that's another example of lack of coordinated action. I think lastly, I'd say, Nev, is that I think there are many national level policies that are really not helping the regions. Education policy come to mind. I'm a biased academic, obviously, but ever since the caps came off, there's been a huge decline in the number of students studying on rural campuses, and unsurprisingly, the skill shortages since then have gone through the roof in all of the rural areas. Voc Ed, we made it a competitive market, so the private providers provide all the courses where you make a lot of money, and all of the ones that are really expensive, like learning to be a diesel mechanic, no one wants to provide it. Well, they can't afford to provide it, so you can hardly do it. So there's less capacity to offer a range of courses. Some other ones, I mentioned funding for local councils. Then you have some really crazy cross-border issues. Housing policy, that's a national level problem, but in rural areas, it's almost impossible to buy a house. So, and it's been made even worse with the latest government incentives to help younger people or first home buyers into the market. Go try and buy a house in a rural area at the moment, you'll find it really hard. And so if you've got labour shortages, how does somebody move into those rural areas? And that also relates to the Voc Ed and the fewer people doing trades and so on. Look, there's a range of things the government could be doing better, in my view. Thanks, Nev.
All right, thanks, Mark. Yeah, a lot to think about there, definitely. Some of which directly related to basin plan water policy, other things directly related to a bunch of other policies, but clearly room for improvement. I'm going to change tack a little bit now and delve into some specific questions and issues around healthy ecosystems, around the basin plan, and in particular, what are the sort of the economic aspects of restoring wetlands, restoring ecosystems, and in particular whether there's perhaps economic opportunities there. People talk about the restoration economy as a new big potential economic activity. So I'm going to actually hand over to Jeremy to provide some comments on restoration of wetlands and ecosystems more broadly, whether there is a economic aspect here we should be thinking more about, and whether current policy in particular is sufficiently looking at these potential economic activities.
Yeah, thanks, Nev. And I think my answer here might that I sort of prepared beforehand might be a little bit off target for what we're talking about, but I'll share it anyway, and then we can come back to it in the question time if that's okay. I think so. The question that we were discussing was, what economic aspects of restoration of, are these visible in current policy frameworks? And for me, the answer is yes. But I think in answering this, I'll just say I'm focusing on the economic aspects for communities and industries. I'm not going to speak on behalf of First Nations in particular, although I would note that there are some really good examples out in the public domain, examples like Yarni Nimikara and work for FVTOC that we've undertaken previously that people can have a look at if they're interested in that. So, but going back to the first point, I would say that economics of restoration is visible in current policy frameworks, but it's a bit of a nuanced answer. And what I mean by that is that whenever we undertake something like a basin plan reform, or whenever we're working on, say, an investment case to decide how we recover that water or how we undertake constraints relaxation, there is an economic analysis that sits under it that compares the benefits of recovering that water to the costs. And when we look at on the cost side, there's often the potential of water coming out of consumptive use, although that is compensated through payments or through infrastructure. And then on the benefit side, the main thing that we look at is the benefit of improved environment, improved wetlands, and that goes to improvements in restoration of environmental outcomes. And for those investments to go ahead, the benefits need to exceed the costs. I think the nuance and where it's not so visible is that those benefits of environmental improvements and of restoration aren't often visible in real transactions. So we're not going to Bunnings and buying it over the counter. What we're doing is we're measuring benefits based on how much people are willing to say they're willing to pay in taxpayer dollars to achieve those outcomes. And that's how we justify the spend through the public purse for doing that. But it's not visible. It's not a transaction that we see occurring in real life. And so for me, I think where we could improve the visibility is the line of sight between those benefits, who they accrue to, and also the disbenefits, so the downside of undertaking these types of activities, and who they also accrue to. And that a clearer articulation of that is really helpful, because there are these policies create winners and losers. As to sort of the second part of your question, which I think is more around, are we going to get an economic boost from restoration activities? Well, the short answer is yes, we do. But we've got to compare the economic benefits of those restoration activities to the costs of achieving them. And again, there's work that's out in the public domain that does that. And to be frank, a lot of the time it shows that the benefits are either difficult to measure because they're non-linear, because there's lags, or because they're confounded in with a whole bunch of other stuff that happens in basin systems like floods and droughts and other things. So tracing that line of sight back to what the benefits are is a challenge. So sorry, that's a bit of a cluttered answer, but I think what I'm saying here is that I think at a high level, the economic aspects of restoration are actually visible in frameworks, but they're not necessarily well articulated. But they are articulated through the government's decision to invest in things like wetland restoration, because it's got to be justified on public benefit grounds. And then the second thing I'm saying is that we can do probably a better job at showing the distribution of those benefits and costs so that people understand them better.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. So the punchline there is there's potential for a restoration economy as a new economic activity, but there's still a lot of work to do to make it a big economic activity. So when we're looking at economic transitions or new economic opportunities, restoration economy could be one, but there's still a little way to go. So I'd like to now actually go to Julia and go back to some work or some things that she said earlier, which is around local government in particular, and how local governments can support local communities and individuals to prosper economically, particularly in these times of uncertainty from things like climate change, fuel prices, global economic crises, water policy, whatever it may be. So Julia, what can local government do, and what are perhaps some of the barriers to local government stepping up and doing stuff?
Oh, thanks, Nev. I'm madly scribbling notes and nodding while Jeremy's talking. So I guess there's a couple of things, and one of the things that I think is really important at this point of the conversation is that we have federal, state, and local government. That we are responsible for a range of different things. And the statistic that I want to use is that for every $1 of tax revenue captured in the country, 3 cents of that comes to local government. So, we've mentioned already the challenges around housing in the regions. We could talk about childcare. We could talk about the impact of both of those things, access to workers. They are all massive challenges that are absolutely being felt at a local level, and yet local council has not a brass razoo to be able to put towards those kinds of topics. And if they are, they're doing it at a point when a state or a federal government should actually be investing in that. Now, I'm not saying they're not investing in that, but the reality is that is incredibly unfair to expect that local councils are going to be able to solve all of these national issues on 3 cents to the dollar when we've also got all of the roles of council to be focusing on. And so the challenge is at a local council is we get roped into every dog fight. We're expected to have something to say around childcare, around housing, around finding workers. And lots of us will advocate for that, and we're going to push to our individual state governments and through to the federal government for support around that. But we just are not resourced to be able to do that. And even when we start to talk about some of the other economies, this regional council, Gundawindi Regional Council, creates about or provides about $1 billion worth of economic revenue into the Australian economy. That's a lot to be transferred and popped into other kind of opportunities. So again, I come back to this piece of agriculture being our really key piece. Now, we know we need to play a role in housing and childcare and the other bits and pieces because that's going to benefit our communities and that's going to help our ratepayers. But there's a balance. So we need to be able to hold on to existing industries whilst also supporting these new and other opportunities and being really clear around what our role is in that and how we can support that. Because at the end of the day, the livability of our regions is a really core part of local government. But often we're not budgeted or we're not funded to be able to really do some of those core elements when we're looking at these really big, meaty topics like what is the Murray-Darling Basin Plan Review going to do for the population of our community. And I think, we have a lot of anecdotal information, and Gundawindi Regional Council is a partner with the One Basin CRC, and we're very excited about being part of the Future Economies project that Mark spoke to, because we have a lot of anecdotal information and other communities will. In the last drought, we lost 50 families anecdotally. We know they don't come back once it rains. And so part of this innovation and part of being entrepreneurial is at what point do we know we also need to hold on to community and hold on to the population that we have in our tiny towns across our region. So I think we've got to be very careful. One last thing, Nev, and then I promise I'll stop talking. We just need to be really careful of the stories that we tell ourselves about the region. So for us in our region, what we're wanting to be really careful of is some of the stories that we talk about in terms of what opportunities we've got. So one of those industries we could bring to town is non-ag based roles that could actually still be based in a country town. So we might not get 50 MDBA staff to Gundawindi, but can we get 5 Atlassian staff? Can we get 7 from another bank to be based here, or whatever it might be? Because those drought-proofed roles are the ones that we need when there's all this change happening for our agricultural industry. I'll leave it there, Nev.
Thanks, Julia. So clearly local government could be doing a hell of a lot more if they had more resources, including supporting, attracting new industries or big corporations, supporting entrepreneurship, etc. And so that kind of leads me a little bit to another question I have for Julie in the Riverland, who represents an area that, as we mentioned before, is going through some challenges around particularly the grape and wine industry. And so, I'm going to ask Julie, how do we actually manage some of these economic and social consequences of contraction in an industry? And this actually also partly addresses, I think, probably Jonathan's question, where he's talking about flexibility and perhaps identifying new enterprises and maybe even might not sound good, but letting certain enterprises going. Why do we keep them going? Why don't we look at other options? So, yeah, Julie, what would you like to say in response to that?
Well, perhaps I'll just start with a few things while Julia was talking, and Jeremy as well. I was also had my notepad and scribbling away. So I had a great example of where regenerative around wetlands and that environmental piece, where it actually came across my emails only yesterday, and it was around fish hotels. It came from a national it's a local tourism business, but certainly mostly internationals, won many awards, which is Murray River Trails, and it was talking about fish hotels, and so that's an environmental piece, and it's very much become part of what their experience is when they're hosting their guests, coming to have a look at the hotels, which is essentially, I don't know, I'm not the environmental person, but essentially it's an area a native fish can go to feel safe, I guess, whatever. I'm sure it has some purpose, and I'm sure many people on this call know what I'm talking about. So, there's an example of that, just that small shift into that space. Now, is that a major economic boost for the region? No, but it's a start. It's a way of integrating a current business and how they're integrating it into their offering. So it's a great example. And I was also going to just talk about we've identified obviously grapes at the moment, massive issue, and we're already seeing on the ground vines being pulled out, and housing developments, developers buying up the land, water licenses being sold off. We're seeing stranded assets with the way the water works and what have you. So we're already seeing serious impact and have many examples of that. We're also seeing we're a real mix in the Riverland of, I'll refer to as maybe corporate farming versus our historical farming, which was wartime blocks. So a lot of farms in the Riverland are known as blockies, and a lot of those are starting to go off the land. A lot of them were grape growers and what have you. So we're seeing an emergence of very large farms coming in, like super fund kind of, Canadian super funds, all those sorts of things. So it's our economy is starting to look a little bit different, and that impacts back into the community as well as to what the makeup of community looks like. So in terms of the economic and social consequences, and how that really plays out, I guess the key area there for me is around that support. No one's doing this alone. It is that absolute role of multiple partners at all levels of government, and 100% agree around that resourcing. I see it day in, day out around the resourcing for local government. But there's a role across all government and also other entities, the not-for-profits and what have you. But the thing that I've seen time and time again, that many of our businesses and community, they actually know what needs to happen. They know what the innovation looks like, in their agricultural piece. They know how they will potentially, where their opportunities are for the value add piece, maybe to diversify, but it also takes so much coordination. So very overwhelming for many of them when they're actually in amongst it, living it. So it's not, they may be being proactive now, but they're proactive because, they're under stress and the community's under stress because of it. So yeah, I don't know whether there's any more you want me to go into there.
No, that's fine, Julie. So I think what I picked up there is there's a coordination role from a bigger being, a government or something similar, or multiple levels of government, but also there are bigger industries who can come in, or in your case are coming in and probably doing okay in some instances. You know, these big corporates, these big big farms have more capital, more finances behind them, and they can adjust to some of the difficult challenges, whether it's related to water, climate, global policy, global, you know, wars, whatever it is. So yeah,
absolutely.
That's good.
And I think also, like, where some of the coordination, and we've used that word a few times when people have been speaking, is also around those opportunities are very corporate. It's about where the market's at right now. And, you know, almonds is a classic example of that. You know, prices are good, you know, markets, huge demand, blah, blah, blah. That's great. They're also very water dependent and require a lot of water. And there's been huge influx of plantings across the Riverland, and I'd be surprised, you know, I imagine that's the case in many other areas along the basin as well. You know, what does that look like? You know, is that who's actually thinking and coordinating some of these things? What does that look like in 10 years' time? You know, are we going to be in the same situation grapes are in right now? You know, what does that look like for other communities when it comes to, you know, the buying of the water? Because again, these are often corporates, so, you know, bigger bank balances.
Yeah, that's true. All right, I'm going to change tack a little bit now, and in particular, I'm going to look at the question in the Q&A from Tony Webber, which is a really fascinating question around having difficult conversations around values and potential trade-offs across those values, whether it's economic, social, environmental, even cultural values and outcomes under a future drying climate that would result in less water. There's a lot of difficult decisions to be made, a lot of difficult conversations to be had that will involve government because they set policy and they have a lot of money to invest at times. And so the question I'm actually going to direct to Jeremy now is whether governments should or should not be more proactive in picking winners, in making those difficult decisions, involved in the debates, etc., around what might need to be traded off. So yeah, Jeremy, what do we think about governments being more proactive in, I guess, shaping the economic landscape and making those difficult trade-off decisions? So I'll ask Jeremy that now, and then I'd like Mark to follow that up as well, and then we'll probably run out of time.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, Nev, and happy to, if, you know, I'm not sure how you're going to handle comments, but if we don't get to them, to write replies, if that's helpful afterwards, or have some other forum. But so I think with my economist hat pretty firmly on, I think there's a really long history of evidence on trying to pick winners and success of being able to do that internationally or in Australia. And the short answer is that we should be rightfully cautious about picking winners. If that means trying to choose particular firms or activities and put all of our money on those things. So, but having said that, that doesn't mean that the government should be passive. And for example, the Productivity Commission, one of my favourite pieces of work they've ever done is the Transitioning Regions report from back in about 2017. If anybody wants to read a lengthy tome, it's well worth a read. But in that work, they talk about how communities are transitioning and also lay down some pretty sensible guidance for how we should be thinking about enabling transition and supporting transition. So they also say it's a much bigger picture than focusing on one industry or one sector. We should be thinking about it from a regional perspective. I think so another way of saying that is that, you know, the scale of change that's going on in the basin may in cases require or justify a more interventionist approach. But I think picking up on what Julia and Julie and Mark have been saying in this conversation, we should be really clear about why we're doing it and how we're coordinating to do that. So we want to, you know, if we're going to intervene, we want to intervene in the right way. So really clear objectives, place-based design, align roles across government, make these things time limited, and make sure that we've got a proper back end that deals with evaluation. And if we have those things in place, you know, I think that we can see interventions supporting communities in ways that communities want to be supported. The second thing that I'd say is that there's probably always a range of ways that governments can intervene that are really low regret actions. And, I've been fortunate to work with DQ on working through this and supporting them, thinking about how on the design of the most recent Supporting Communities Fund. And, part of that is looking at how do we get rid of unnecessary regulatory or policy barriers. How do we improve information so people understand what's coming and feel comfortable and confident about what's coming? How do we reduce frictions in labour and capital movement? So, for example, so that people from Atlassian can move to places where they might want to work from and work remotely? And how can we also get rid of subsidies and other things that mask long-term signals because they distort markets in ways that result in people wanting to gravitate towards larger cities or regions? So I think just in the interest of time, I might actually leave it there. I think the only thing that I'd end with is that, again, back in what Julie and Mark were saying, is make sure that we're really clear on who does what. So, the Commonwealth's role is ultimately just national settings and coordination. The primary responsibility for this stuff should rightly sit with states and then local government on implementation. And, it is a really, really constrained environment that local government works in. It is a small amount of money. It's more money per capita than we get in the cities, but that's because these populations are spread across really large areas, and so it costs more to service them. So ultimately, the question for government should be, are we collectively comfortable and wanting to do that as a nation? And I think, frankly, that's a question that a lot of national and state policy hasn't really specifically addressed.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And I was hoping to give Mark time to respond, but we are actually almost out of time. And there was something I really wanted to do in the last couple of minutes, but given that Mark is on the screen, I'll ask him first. In one sentence, so very, very short, just a few seconds, what would be your single most important call to action for the Basin Plan review?
Look, I think there's a broad need to understand the blueprint for supporting rural and regional areas. It's not just about providing a pot of money. And I think that all levels of government need to be present and engaged in a way that they haven't previously. I just echo Jeremy's comment that I actually think local governments are suboptimally funded. They get too little funding for the job they need to do, which means that major resources that they might have a primary role in helping manage and are important for the wealth of our nation are optimally managed. We need to be more flexible and adaptable, less locked in the way these funding schemes are working, where we have a strong case for what needs to be addressed. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark. I'm going to have one more person share their thought on what is the single most important call to action of the Basin Plan review, and I'd like Julia to share her thoughts on that.
Oh, Nev. So I'm going to be really parochial from a small regional community and from a local government, but productivity and the ability for our community to continue to stay in control of their own destiny is really important. And so that may be, and I'm seeing the other questions, it is important to keep environment and the social, and it's important to keep environment, but at some point, if we do, this could be controversial, if we do we need to make sure that we're looking after our people as much as we're looking after the fish.
All right, thanks, Julia. Now we have run out of time. It's unfortunate. We could go for much longer, I'm sure, and including a few questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to really address in a lot of depth. But I do hope very much that you've enjoyed today's session, and I think there's a screen coming up. Yep, there is a website that you can go to learn more about what the CRC is doing in relation to the Basin Plan review, and you can watch this again if you like to. So yes, thank you again for joining. I hope you have enjoyed and got a lot out of that, and I'll see you again sometime soon.